In a small quiet town, where most people knew each other by name, there lived a woman named Inspira. She was not the kind of person anyone noticed at first glance. Her life was simple, almost too ordinary for anyone to think twice about. She worked at a small shop in the market, selling everyday things like flour, rice, and oil. Every morning, she would walk the same road with a bag in her hand, greet the same neighbors with a small smile, and open the same creaky door of her shop. People liked her because she was polite and helpful, but nobody ever thought there was anything unusual or remarkable about her. To most, Inspira was just that quiet woman who minds her own business. She had no flashy clothes, no loud laugh that filled the streets, no stories that spread through the town. Children did not run to her with excitement, and grown-ups did not sit with her for long talks. She was there, always there, but never in the center of anything. Some even forgot her name, though she passed by them every day. That was the kind of life Inspira lived, simple, silent, and unnoticed. One day, the town's community school decided to host a small cultural program. It was not a grand event, but for the people of the town, it was something to look forward to. Parents dressed their children in neat clothes, teachers prepared songs and plays, and everyone looked forward to music and laughter. The hall of the school was decorated with colored paper chains, small lights, and banners made by children. Excitement was in the air, and the teachers wanted everything to be perfect. Among the instruments arranged for the program was a violin. It was an old one, slightly dusty, with strings that looked like they had not been played in years. Nobody wanted to use it, because the students were not trained enough to handle it. The teachers discussed who could possibly play it, but soon laughed it off, saying, "It will just sit there. No one knows how to make proper music out of it." While preparing, a few teachers noticed Inspira standing at the back. She had come to help with arranging chairs and serving tea, as she always did during community events. She never pushed herself forward, she was simply there to lend a hand, quietly doing small tasks. That was when one teacher, half-jokingly, said, "Why don't we ask Inspira to play the violin? Imagine how funny that would be." The others chuckled. The idea of this quiet, simple woman holding a violin seemed almost laughable to them. To their minds, she had no special skills, no talent that anyone had seen. "She won't even know how to hold it properly," one whispered. They thought it would be a harmless joke, something to lighten the mood before the program began. So they called her. "Inspira," one of the teachers said with a playful smile, "why don't you try the violin? We want to see you play." At first, she looked surprised. Her hands, which had been busy folding papers, paused in mid-air. She looked at the violin, then at the group of teachers. They were smiling, but not the kind of smile that meant kindness. It was the kind of smile that expected a funny scene. Inspira could sense it. She was not naive. She knew they were not serious, but she also felt no anger. She was used to being underestimated. She gave a small nod, her eyes soft and calm, and walked toward the violin. The hall grew quieter as people noticed what was happening. Parents turned their heads, children giggled, and even some teachers leaned forward, ready to watch what they thought would be a clumsy attempt. Inspira picked up the violin with gentle hands, as if she was touching something precious. Her movements were careful, respectful, not hurried. The way she held it surprised a few observant eyes. It was not completely awkward, though no one paid attention to that detail yet. A hush spread across the room. Everyone waited for the sound of squeaky, broken notes that would make them laugh. A few children covered their mouths, ready to giggle. The teachers leaned back in their chairs, expecting to enjoy the show. Inspira stood still for a moment, her fingers brushing against the strings. Her face remained calm, her lips pressed together lightly, her eyes lowered as if she was speaking to the instrument silently. Then, without warning, she lifted the bow and touched it to the strings. The very first sound that came out was not broken or harsh. It was smooth, steady, and filled with emotion. It was the kind of sound that makes people stop in the middle of a thought. A deep silence fell across the hall. Children who had been ready to laugh now sat frozen, their eyes wide. Teachers who had been smiling suddenly leaned forward, their faces changing. Parents turned fully toward the stage, trying to understand what they had just heard. Amira's fingers moved with ease, her bow glided as though she had done this thousands of times before. The tune she played was not random. It was soft, soulful, and strangely familiar, like a lullaby that carried memories within it. Her eyes closed slowly, and her whole being seemed to melt into the music. It was not a performance anymore, it was as if the violin was a part of her voice, speaking emotions she never spoke out loud. For a long moment, no one moved. The sound filled the room, echoing gently against the decorated walls, weaving through the crowd like a quiet spell. Every note seemed to carry a story, though nobody knew what story it was. They only felt it. The laughter that had been expected never came. Instead, there was silence, deep and heavy, as if the world outside the hall had also paused to listen. The teachers, who had thought it would be a joke, looked at each other with wide eyes. Their amusement had turned into disbelief. They could not understand how the same woman they saw sweeping the shop floor, the same woman who carried grocery bags down the street, was now standing before them and playing the violin like a true musician. It was beyond their imagination. The moment stretched, and Amira kept playing. Her body swayed gently with the rhythm, her fingers dancing across the strings. She seemed unaware of the eyes watching her. For her, there was only the violin and the music. By the time the last note faded, the entire hall was still in shock. The bow lowered slowly, and Amira opened her eyes. For a second, she looked almost shy again, as if she was waking from a dream. She did not smile, nor did she wait for applause. She simply stood there, quietly holding the violin, the same way she always held everything in her life with calm simplicity. But this time, the silence around her was not the silence of being unnoticed. It was the silence of awe. When the first notes came out of the violin, it was as if time itself had stopped inside the hall. No one had expected such a sound from her. A few people blinked, unsure if they had truly heard what they thought they heard. Children who were leaning forward to laugh now froze with their mouths half open. The parents sitting in the back straightened up, their eyes suddenly wide. Even the teachers who had suggested the idea as a joke sat in stunned silence. Amira's bow moved across the strings with such grace that it looked natural, as though she had been born to hold that violin. Her hands did not shake, her fingers did not stumble. Each note came out strong and full, carrying feelings that touched even those who had no understanding of music. The melody was soft yet powerful, like a secret voice that had been waiting for years to be heard. The audience, at first surprised, soon began to sink into the rhythm. The sound carried something almost magical, an old sadness, a hidden strength, and a kind of beauty that went beyond words. Some children who were restless before now sat still, their eyes fixed on her. A few parents leaned closer together, whispering in disbelief. The teachers who had laughed felt their faces grow warm. The amusement they had expected was gone, replaced by something else: shame, surprise, and respect all tangled together. None of them had thought this quiet woman could hold such power in her hands. Amira, however, was not thinking of them. With her eyes gently closed, she seemed to have stepped away from the hall. She was no longer in front of a crowd. She was in a different place, perhaps in memories that belonged only to her. The way her fingers moved, the way her body swayed slightly with the tune, showed that this was not performance for her. It was a deep conversation with the violin, with herself, and with the emotions she had carried silently for years. The longer she played, the stronger the effect grew. People in the hall felt something stir inside them. Some were reminded of their own struggles, their own dreams that never came true, or moments of joy long forgotten. Others simply felt a calmness that washed over them, as if the music carried them to a place where worries faded. Every now and then, Amira would open her eyes, not to look at the audience, but to glance at the strings, making sure her bow was exactly where it should be. Then she would close them again, letting herself return to the world of sound. She did not look nervous, she did not look proud. She looked free. One of the teachers who had mocked her the most felt his throat tighten. He remembered the way he had laughed minutes earlier, thinking it would be entertaining to see her struggle. Now he could barely meet her face. Another teacher whispered under her breath, how is this possible?" But her voice carried a tremble of guilt. The melody climbed higher, filled with passion. The hall seemed to shake with the richness of the notes. Some parents, unable to stop themselves, clapped softly in rhythm, though they quickly grew quiet, not wanting to break the spell. The children, who rarely sat still for anything, were drawn into the music as though it was telling them a story. Even the smallest ones stared without blinking, sensing something important was happening even if they did not understand it. Finally, the song began to slow. The bow glided more gently, as if saying goodbye to each note. The final sound lingered in the air, trembling softly, before disappearing into silence. Amira lowered the violin slowly, her hand resting on it with tenderness. No one clapped immediately. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was heavy with awe. People were still trying to breathe in what they had just experienced. For a few seconds, the entire hall seemed frozen. Only after a deep breath did one person begin to clap, and then another, until the sound of applause filled the room like a wave. It was not the kind of clapping people give out of politeness. It was the kind of clapping that comes from the heart, filled with respect and amazement. Amira looked down at the floor, shyly. She was not used to attention, not used to being the center of so many eyes. Her fingers still rested on the violin, as if she could not bear to put it down yet. She did not bow, did not speak. She just stood there quietly, letting the noise of applause roll over her. Some people in the crowd had tears in their eyes. They did not know why, but the music had touched something deep within them. Parents turned to each other, whispering, "Who knew she could play like that?" Others shook their heads, still stunned. "She has been here all this time, and we never knew." The teachers, however, felt something more than surprise. They felt regret. What had begun as a small joke now felt like a heavy mistake. They had underestimated her, treated her talent lightly, and now they were faced with the truth: they had laughed at someone who was far greater than they had imagined. One of the teachers, a woman who had joined in the laughter earlier, now leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "We should never have asked her like that. This is no joke. She's incredible." Amira finally lifted her eyes, her face calm as ever. For a moment, her gaze passed over the room. She saw the parents, the children, the teachers. She saw their surprise, their admiration, their guilt. But she did not show anger. There was no need. The music had already spoken for her, louder than any words ever could. The hall was filled with murmurs now, as people tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Some children clapped again, giggling in excitement. A man at the back shook his head slowly, saying to himself, "I thought she was just an ordinary shopwoman. I never knew she had this inside her." The violin in her hands no longer looked like an old, forgotten instrument. In her touch, it seemed alive, shining with a dignity that had been hidden under dust for too long. People looked at it differently now, because they looked at her differently. The applause continued, but deep inside every person in that hall, there was more than clapping. There was a lesson forming quietly. They had all seen how quickly they judged someone, how easily they dismissed a quiet soul, how fast they turned her into a subject of a joke. And yet, in the end, it was she who stood above them, showing strength without a single harsh word. Amira finally placed the violin gently on the table. She gave a small smile, not wide, not dramatic, just enough to soften her face. Without saying much, she stepped back, ready to fade again into the background. But she did not know that from this moment on, she would never be in the background again. The people in the hall would not forget what they had just seen and heard. They would talk about it for days, weeks, maybe even years. And the teachers who had started it all would carry the weight of regret, mixed with respect, every time they remembered the sound of that violin. For Amira, though, it was just a moment of truth. She had not played to prove herself, nor to shame anyone. She had played because the music was inside her, waiting to come out. And once it did, the world around her could never look at her the same way again. After the applause settled and the whispers filled the hall, people began to ask questions. It was as if curiosity had taken over the air. Nobody could believe that Amira, the quiet woman who had always walked unnoticed among them, could play the violin with such mastery. Parents leaned forward to talk to one another, children asked their mothers, "How did she learn that?" and teachers sat silently, ashamed to face her but desperate to know more. Amira, however, remained calm. She quietly set the violin back down, her hands brushing against the polished wood as if saying farewell to an old friend. She did not speak, nor did she offer an explanation. She had never been the type to announce her story. But the people around her could not rest without an answer. They needed to know how this hidden talent had been buried in their town without anyone noticing. Later that evening, after the program ended, a small group of teachers and parents gathered near her. At first, they hesitated, unsure if they had the right to ask. One teacher finally stepped forward and said softly, "Amira, forgive us, but, how? How did you learn to play like that?" Her eyes lifted, gentle but steady. She seemed to search their faces for a moment before answering. Her voice was calm, quiet, but carried a weight that silenced the entire group. "It was a long time ago," she began. They leaned in, their curiosity growing stronger. For the first time, Amira spoke about a part of her life that very few had ever heard. She told them that when she was young, she had a dream. Music had called to her like nothing else. Her father, though not wealthy, had once bought her a violin from a traveling merchant. It was second-hand, scratched, and old, but to her it was treasure. Every evening, after school and chores, she would sit by the window and practice. At first, the sound was rough, but she never gave up. The neighbors sometimes complained about the squeaks and sharp notes, but Amira did not stop. She had found something that made her feel alive, something that gave her soul a voice. In those early years, she was fortunate enough to meet a kind man who became her mentor. He was a retired musician who had moved to the town for a quieter life. Seeing her passion, he agreed to guide her. He had no family of his own, so he spent hours teaching her how to hold the bow correctly, how to let the violin sing instead of cry, and how to pour her heart into every note. Under his guidance, she grew quickly. Soon, she could play melodies that made even him smile with pride. Her dream was simple yet powerful. She wanted to study music formally and one day perform on bigger stages. She imagined herself standing in front of an audience, the lights above her, the sound of her violin filling grand halls. She imagined her family smiling proudly in the crowd. That dream kept her alive, kept her moving forward. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Her family fell into hardship. Her father's small business failed, and her mother grew sick. Amira, being the eldest, had no choice but to step in. The lessons stopped, her mentor eventually moved away, and she set aside her violin to take on work that would support her family. Day by day, her dream grew smaller, buried under the weight of responsibilities. Yet, she could not let it die completely. In the quiet of the night, after finishing her long day of work, she would take out her violin. She practiced silently, sometimes even placing a cloth over the strings to muffle the sound so she would not disturb anyone. The world outside never knew, but in her little room, she kept the fire of her music alive. Years passed. She grew older, her responsibilities heavier. People began to see her only as the woman who worked at the shop, the woman who lived a simple life. Nobody remembered her as the girl with big dreams. They did not know that every line on her face, every tired look in her eyes, carried a story of sacrifice and quiet perseverance. As Inspira spoke, the group around her listened with deep respect. Some of them lowered their heads, ashamed for ever underestimating her. Others felt a strange ache in their hearts, because they too had once had dreams that life had taken away. She continued, "I never told anyone because, it did not matter anymore. Life asked me to be strong for my family, and that was enough. The violin was mine alone, my secret companion. I never needed anyone to know." Her words were simple, but they struck everyone deeply. They realized that behind her quietness had always been a strength they had overlooked. She was not just a simple woman, they had been blind to the depth of her story. One of the teachers, his voice thick with regret, said, "We laughed, we thought it would be funny. We are sorry, Inspira. We did not know." Inspira gave a small smile. "It does not matter," she replied gently. "Sometimes people see only what is on the surface. That is human. But music shows the truth, even when words cannot." The parents in the group exchanged looks. Some nodded, tears welling in their eyes. They felt they had witnessed something extraordinary, something rare. Their children, who had once looked at Inspira as just another face in the town, now asked eagerly if she could teach them too. Inspira shook her head at first, modestly. She did not see herself as a teacher or someone great. But the spark in the children's eyes reminded her of her own youth, of the way she once looked at her violin as if it held all the dreams in the world. The hall that had once been filled with laughter at her expense was now filled with whispers of admiration. People who had ignored her for years now looked at her with new eyes. The teachers, who had started the whole thing as a joke, sat quietly, thinking about how easily they had judged. They knew they had learned a lesson they would never forget. That night, when Inspira walked home under the dim light of the street lamps, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She did not feel invisible anymore. She did not feel like just the woman at the shop. She carried her violin in her hands, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel proud. The community had seen her truth. They had glimpsed the years of practice, the sacrifice, the love she had poured into her music. They finally understood that behind her quiet face was a soul that had refused to let go of beauty, even when life tried to silence it. And as she stepped into her small home, placing the violin gently in its old case, she whispered to herself, "Maybe it is not too late. Maybe music still has a place for me." She did not know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: the secret she had kept hidden for so long was now out in the open. And it had changed everything, not just for her, but for everyone who had heard her play that day. The next day after the event, the whole town was buzzing with whispers. People who had not even attended the program were already hearing about it. In the tea stalls, in the marketplace, even in the narrow streets, the same story spread like fire. "Did you hear what happened at the school? The quiet shopwoman played the violin, and it was unlike anything we've ever heard." At first, some laughed in disbelief, thinking it was just an exaggeration. But those who had been in the hall shook their heads firmly. "No, it's true," they said. "You had to be there. She played like a professional. Not a sound was out of place. It was like her soul was speaking through that violin." Soon, Inspira's name was on everyone's lips. People who had once ignored her now asked questions about her, wanting to know who she really was. Children who used to pass her shop without a thought now peeked inside shyly, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had surprised the whole town. Meanwhile, the teachers who had started it all felt uneasy. They could not forget the shame they felt when she first began to play. What had been a moment of careless joking had turned into a life lesson they would carry for years. Some of them decided to visit her shop the following morning. When they entered, Amira was busy arranging items on the shelves. She looked up, surprised to see them, but smiled politely as she always did. For a few moments, the teachers stood awkwardly, not sure how to begin. Finally, one of them cleared his throat and said, "Amira, we came to apologize." She blinked, tilting her head slightly. "We laughed at you," another admitted, her voice heavy. "We asked you to play as a joke. But instead, you gave us something unforgettable. We feel ashamed. We should never have treated you like that." Amira's face softened. She placed the items on the counter and shook her head gently. "There is no need," she said quietly. "You did not know. And maybe, if you hadn't asked, I would never have played at all." The teachers were moved by her kindness. One of them said earnestly, "But you must play again. Not just for us, but for everyone. People deserve to hear your gift." Amira hesitated. For years, she had played only for herself. The thought of playing in front of others again made her nervous. But deep inside, there was also a spark. Perhaps this was the moment she had been waiting for all her life. A few weeks later, the school organized another gathering, this time not for a cultural program but for a special performance. This time, Amira was invited with respect, not mockery. Posters were put up around town, "Come and hear the hidden talent of our own Amira." On the evening of the event, the hall was packed. Families filled every seat, children sat on the floor, and even people from neighboring villages came, curious to see the woman everyone was talking about. The old violin, now polished and tuned carefully, was placed on the stage, waiting. When Amira entered, the crowd clapped loudly. She looked around, her heart beating fast. Never before had she seen so many faces looking at her with admiration. She held the violin in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly, but when she lifted the bow, her nerves melted away. The first notes rose into the air, and once again, silence fell over the crowd. The melody was different this time, brighter, more hopeful, filled with light. It was as though she wanted to give the people not just music, but also a piece of her heart. The sound spread across the hall, wrapping around every listener like a warm blanket. Some closed their eyes to feel it more deeply, while others sat frozen, not wanting to miss a single moment. Children leaned forward, their mouths open in wonder. Parents exchanged looks of pride, as though they too were part of her story. By the time she finished, the applause was thunderous. People stood on their feet, clapping and cheering. Some even shouted her name. Amira, who had once been invisible in this very town, was now standing on the stage as the center of attention. After the performance, people crowded around her. They asked her questions, they praised her, they thanked her for sharing something so beautiful. A few parents even asked if she would teach their children music. At first, she laughed softly, shaking her head. But when she saw the eager faces of the children, she began to think differently. Maybe this was her chance to pass on what she had learned. From that day forward, Amira's life began to change. The school offered her a small room where she could teach violin lessons. At first, only a few children came, but soon the number grew. Some parents who could not afford instruments encouraged their children to sit and learn just by watching. Amira welcomed everyone with equal warmth. Her teaching style was gentle. She never scolded or pressured the children. Instead, she encouraged them to feel the music, to let their hearts guide their fingers. "A violin is not just wood and strings," she would tell them softly. "It is a voice. If you respect it, it will speak for you." The children adored her. They admired her patience, her calmness, and the way she believed in them. Even the shyest students began to find confidence through her lessons. Parents noticed the difference and thanked Inspira again and again. The teachers, too, learned from her. They stopped seeing her as the quiet shopwoman and started treating her as a respected figure in the community. They often invited her to school events, not just as a helper but as a guest of honor. Whenever she played, the room grew silent, just as it had the first time. Her story spread beyond the town. A local journalist heard about her and wrote an article titled "The Violin of the Forgotten Dream." Soon, people from nearby cities wanted to meet her. Some invited her to perform at their events. Each time she played, she carried with her not just music but also the story of perseverance, sacrifice, and hidden strength. But through it all, Inspira remained humble. She still walked the same road to her shop, still greeted her neighbors with the same small smile. Fame did not change her. She often reminded people, "I am still the same Inspira. The violin is not about me, it is about the music." And yet, everyone knew that she was no longer the same in their eyes. She had taught them an unforgettable lesson: never judge someone by what you see on the surface. Hidden inside even the simplest person might be a treasure waiting for the right moment to shine. Eeks after Inspira's second performance turned into months, and slowly, what had started as a single moment of surprise became a permanent change in the way people saw her. She was no longer just the quiet woman who worked at the shop. She was now spoken of with respect. Whenever people passed her on the street, they greeted her warmly, often stopping to ask how her music lessons were going or when she would play again. Children who once ignored her now waved excitedly whenever they saw her. Inspira herself did not seek attention. She continued to live her life simply, walking the same roads and keeping her shop open as always. But now, in the evenings, her shop became a gathering place for young students. Children came carrying small violins borrowed or bought by their parents, and those who had no instruments still came just to listen and learn. Inspira welcomed everyone. She never turned a child away, believing that music belonged to all, not just those who could afford it. Her teaching was unlike that of ordinary instructors. She did not just focus on technique. She told stories about how music could heal sadness, how it could carry emotions that words could never express. She encouraged her students to close their eyes, to listen to their own hearts, and to let the violin speak for them. Slowly, the children grew better, not only in skill but also in confidence. Parents often said, "Inspira has not only taught them music, she has given them courage." Word of her work spread even further. People from neighboring towns brought their children to learn from her. Some even suggested opening a small music school, but Inspira always shook her head with a gentle smile. "I don't need a big school," she said. "As long as there are children who want to learn, I will teach them, even if it is in my small shop." Her humility made people love her even more. They admired how she never let pride change her. She could have asked for money, could have charged high fees, but she never did. For her, music was not a business, it was a gift, and gifts were meant to be shared. The same teachers who once mocked her now stood beside her with respect. They often invited her to the school to guide students, not only in music but in life lessons. Whenever she entered the school hall, the children clapped for her, and the teachers bowed their heads slightly, remembering the day when they had misjudged her so badly. The regret never fully left them, but it turned into gratitude. They were thankful that Inspira had forgiven them and shown them something greater than their mistake. One evening, the school organized a large event in her honor. This time, she was not a hidden surprise but the main guest. The hall was decorated beautifully, filled with flowers and lights. People of all ages gathered, and the excitement in the air was different from before. It was not curiosity anymore, it was admiration. When Inspira stepped onto the stage, carrying her violin, the audience stood to welcome her. She felt her heart swell, not with pride, but with warmth. She thought of her younger self, the girl who once dreamed of music but had to bury her dream. She thought of the lonely nights when she practiced in silence, when nobody knew and nobody cared. And now, here she was, standing before hundreds of people, loved and respected for the very thing she once thought she had lost forever. She played that night with all her heart. The melody was full of hope and light, a celebration of life, of resilience, and of second chances. Some people cried softly, some closed their eyes and let the sound carry them, and others clapped along gently with the rhythm. By the end of the performance, the applause was so loud it echoed through the town. After the program, the head teacher stepped forward and spoke into the microphone. "Amira," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "you have taught us all a lesson we will never forget. We laughed once, and we regret it deeply. But you have shown us what true strength looks like. You have reminded us never to judge, never to underestimate, and always to respect the hidden gifts in people around us. You are not only a musician, you are an inspiration." The crowd cheered, and for the first time in her life, Amira felt truly seen. Not just as a woman in the background, not just as a helper at events, but as someone who had given her town a memory they would carry forever. From that day on, her story became part of the town's history. Parents told their children about the quiet woman who had once been mocked but turned out to be the brightest light among them. Teachers reminded students never to laugh at anyone, because they might be hiding a gift greater than anyone could imagine. Amira's name became a symbol of humility, patience, and quiet strength. For Amira, life did not change in material ways. She still lived in her small home, still worked at her shop. But inside, everything felt different. She no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt like her sacrifices had buried her completely. She had found a way to honor her dream, not by standing on big stages in faraway cities, but by sharing her gift right where she was needed the most, in her own town, among her own people. Every evening, as she locked up her shop and walked home with her violin in hand, she would hear children calling out, "Teacher Amira." Their voices made her smile, and in those moments, she felt richer than anyone could ever imagine. Years later, when those children grew up, many of them carried the love of music with them. Some became musicians, others simply kept music in their hearts, but all of them remembered the gentle woman who had taught them more than notes and strings. She had taught them to respect others, to believe in themselves, and to never stop dreaming, no matter how hard life became. And so, Amira's story lived on, not just as the tale of a woman who played the violin, but as a lesson that changed a whole community. She had shown them that greatness can hide in the most ordinary people, waiting for the right moment to shine. Whenever people in the town gathered and someone spoke her name, there was always a quiet pause, a moment of respect. Because they all remembered the day when a simple woman picked up a violin as a joke and ended up teaching them the most important lesson of their lives.